the profaning of marriage, all the rest of these things, requires such a radical departure in the interpretation of Scripture that there's no way you can any longer maintain those other doctrines. Now, you may be schizophrenic. You may be a Matthew Vines that says, I'm an evangelical, or a Justin Lee, or even a Graham Codrington. But if someone starts pushing you to be consistent, it's a house of cards. It's gonna collapse, because you've gutted it of what the thing that makes Christianity, and that is, this is a supernatural faith. It's been revealed by God in Scripture. All right? So, it has been my thesis, has been my assertion. You all have heard it. Those of you who've regularly listened, you've heard me say this over and over and over again. But now I have two glowing examples of it. And once the videos are available, because both of them were recorded, I'll probably put together a screen flow to show you. So, what do I mean? Well, let's start with Graham. I mentioned before I went to South Africa that in listening to Graham Codrington's discussion of Romans 1, I was blown away. I was blown away. Why? Because his fundamental argument on Romans 1, well, he backed off on this in the debate. I mean, if you knew what his position was, you could still hear he was saying it, but he knows better. He knows in his heart of hearts that the position he has now taken on Romans 1 is so radical that it's indefensible. It can only be of use to the already convinced. And that was the position that fundamentally Romans 1:18 through 32 is a Greek rhetorical device where Paul is quoting from a Jewish source, and people like to point to the wisdom of Solomon, though there are some actually fundamental differences between the wisdom of Solomon and Paul's understanding, but that may be something we may want to look at. In fact, I would recommend to you, if you have a copy of the Apocrypha, that you read the Wisdom of Solomon, especially chapters 11 through 15 or so. And there are some fascinating parallels to what Paul says. There's also some fascinating differences that tend to get glossed over. But anyway, the idea is that he is giving the standard Jewish understanding of that day. And then in chapter 2, he says, but who are you? He changes the point of address. And now what he's doing is he's arguing against the Jews and the position that was just enunciated in verses 18 through 32. So the rest of the book is an argument against verses 18 through 32. And he jumps all the way to chapter 14. I mean, talk about skipping massive context changes and everything else. I mean, it just destroys Romans. And that's why, like I said, the 1994 article, Calvin Porter, a couple of people have picked up on that. It is such a tiny little minority view off in the corner someplace, but hey, the homosexual movement will use anything. It doesn't matter. The last thing they're concerned about is maintaining any kind of biblical exegesis, so grab at anything you can. But it makes mincemeat out of the book of Romans. Jump to Romans chapter 14, and the whole idea is do not be judging one another. And so it's you're trying to get peace between the Jews and the Gentiles in the church, and that's what Romans 1 is all about. Well, that is not the exegesis that led the church to any of its orthodox beliefs. And Graham starts off talking about how he's an evangelical Christian, how the Bible is God's final authority. Those are his specific words. I'm looking at my notes here. And yet, once you adopt this type of radical reinterpretation of something as central as, I mean, Romans 1:18-32 is part and parcel of Paul's hamartiology, his doctrine of sin. So once you dismiss that, what are you going to do? I mean, you can't put it back together again. And the only reason you've done this is to get around verses 26 and 27. That's the only reason. And so here you have this willingness. And by the way, I had an interesting experience. Why is this cooling down so fast? I need a more insulated mug for the future, because we're only halfway through, and it's really. We'll find out what the microwave does after the program's over. That's too good to throw out. I had a very interesting experience during the break in the debate. Graham comes up to me with a older lady next to him, introduces me. It's his mom. And he says, I want you to know she's firmly on your side. Now that was almost as weird as when George Bryson's wife went after him after the debate for not having brought this up and that up and all the rest of this kind of stuff. It was like, really? See, Graham is a graduate of the Baptist Union Seminary down there in South Africa. And a lot of people in the conservative churches knew who he was. And so, there are even people in his family that are rooting for the other side in this particular debate. So that was a strange experience. But the point is, here's a guy who, though he has a conservative background, has been moving farther and farther and farther away from that conservative background. And the question is, why? Well, the Bible's teaching on sexual ethics and morality is not difficult to discern. But once you buy the idea that the church has been wrong, and the church has been mistreating our LGBTQRSTUVWXYZ brothers and sisters, and so you grab hold of experience